afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar today. We have Mr. Dhyan Chinnappa, Senior Advocate and Advocate General of the Karnataka High Court, as the speaker for the day, and he will be speaking to us on the evolution of fundamental rights jurisprudence over the last 10 years. He will be happy to take questions at the end of the session. Over to you. Unmuted.
Thank you, Goda. And welcome to all the attendees for today's session. I have a topic which is fairly interesting and which possibly could have no correct answers, since we're speaking of fundamental rights and fundamental rights over the last 10 years, which I think has seen dramatic changes. Not merely from the point of view of the fact that there were rights which were always protected, but you saw in the last few years, at least in the last 4 years, a systematic attempt at protecting the rights of those who are the most wanting. And those rights were protected by many courts throughout the country, but in particular the Supreme Court of India. Any discussion on fundamental rights, of course, will have to look at the judgments of the Supreme Court, because after all, the Constitution is what the judges say is the Constitution. How I've broken up my talk today is to divide it into mainly 4 core issues. The first is going to be the principle of manifest arbitrariness. The second is going to be the silences of the Constitution. Third, constitutional morality. And finally, transformative constitution, that is ours. I think to start off with the first principle, that is the greatest gift, if I may say, that Justice Nariman gave to all lawyers of evolving the principle of manifest arbitrariness. One Chief Justice pointed out once that manifest arbitrariness was a principle which was a long time back by an eminent lawyer who lost the point, then became a judge, and thereafter made it the law. Although in McDowell's case, the Supreme Court held that that was not a ground to challenge plenary legislation, but only a ground to challenge subordinate legislation. Subsequently, Justice Nariman, in Shaira Banu's case, ultimately laid down that principle in a split verdict, of course, but laid down the principle of manifest arbitrariness as a principle which has now gained acceptance of all courts in India. And I'm saying this because ultimately the 9-judge bench in the privacy case upheld the principle of manifest arbitrariness and said that is practically today's rule of law. If you look at objectively, manifest arbitrariness is not something alien to the argument of reasonableness, because manifest arbitrariness really emanates from the principle of reasonableness. And being a principle of reasonableness, it manifests itself when the law is entirely arbitrary. We can't forget what in Maneka Gandhi the Supreme Court said, that if you're going to test the law under Article 21, for instance, that law should be fair, just and reasonable. And reasonable meaning it shouldn't be arbitrary. Therefore, although it is much criticized, manifest arbitrariness is really a principle that has evolved from reasonableness. Therefore, if you look at it objectively, it is not a new principle, but an evolution of a principle which was always there. But in the hands of lawyers today, of course, if you are for a petitioner challenging the constitutional validity of a law, it is quite ideal. And this principle has now been used extensively over the last few years to strike down laws, to strike down practices as being manifestly arbitrary. Actually, the principle of manifest arbitrariness started for the first time in Shaira Banu's case. As we all know, it's the challenge to the triple talaq. Why I'm going to start with triple talaq today is because, according to me, that judgment doesn't lay down any real constitutional law issue at all, yet strikes down a practice which has been there for hundreds of years, but which practice was found to be completely illegal. Why I'm saying this is because if you look at Shaira Banu's case, Shaira Banu was a case where the Supreme Court was sharply divided. It was so sharply divided that it came down to one judge to ultimately say as to what was and how the practice of triple talaq should be interpreted. Now, triple talaq is, to most of us, may sound abhorrent and something which should never have had great difficulty in passing or not passing constitutional muster. But you find that it took 5 judges and a completely divided bench with Chief Justice Kehar and Justice Nazir holding that it forms an integral part of the religion, and Justice Nariman and Justice Lalit holding that it does not. They don't say it does not, but they say it is something which is governed by the Muslim Personal Law Shariat Application Act of 1937. Now this assumes significance because it was the interpretation of this law which led to finding that it was that this practice of triple talaq was manifestly arbitrary. But before I go to that, this entire 1937 Act was an act which brought together certain principles of Mohammedan law and said that these principles of Mohammedan law will only be applicable if it is in accordance with Shariat. All other contrary to Shariat are invalid. Now the 2 judges said it is an integral part of the law. It is not an integral part of the law. That is Chief Justice Kehar and Justice Nazir, and therefore you could not strike down that which is not governed by this 1937 Act. Justice Nariman and Justice Lalit held it falls within the Act, that triple talaq is something which is governed by the Act, and since it is governed by the Act, therefore you can strike it down as being manifestly arbitrary. Now you had a divergent view here, and it boiled down to the 3rd judge or the 5th judge here to take a decision on this issue. Now if you notice Justice Kurian Joseph's judgment, Justice Kurian Joseph doesn't side either ways. He first says that triple talaq is not governed by the 1937 Act. Then he says he agrees with the principle of manifest arbitrariness as a law, as a principle to strike down arbitrary laws, but takes a completely different approach to this entire issue. What he does is he says that the Shariat does not recognize triple talaq. And since the Shariat does not recognize triple talaq, it is not in accordance with the 1937 Act and therefore strikes it down. Therefore it is, I may say, a very peculiar scenario where, owing to an interpretation which none of the 4 judges took, that triple talaq was ultimately struck down by virtue of the 5th judge. If people know this, even if you look back at Keshwananda Bharati, Justice Khanna's opinion, which tilted the balance, while interpreting Article 368 of the Constitution of India, 6 judges held that the power to amend the Constitution is absolute. It extends to any part of the Constitution. It extends to the Fundamental Rights Chapter as well, and then held that the power to amend the Constitution is absolute. The other 6 judges on the other side held that it is not absolute, it is subject to limitations, but couldn't agree on what those limitations were. It is in that circumstance that Justice Khanna's view, which we all celebrate today, assumed so much significance. So Justice Khanna took an absolute middle ground, like possibly Justice Kurian Joseph did. He agreed with the minority that there is an absolute power to amend the Constitution, including the Fundamental Rights Chapter, but ultimately held that it is subject to that beautiful doctrine that has come of universal acceptance in India, called the Basic Structure Doctrine. And that is how ultimately the power to amend was limited by the Basic Structure Doctrine. And I'll speak about that a little later, but I just wanted to point out as to how the manifest arbitrariness concept became accepted as a law in India is mainly because of Justice Kurian Joseph's one-line acceptance of Justice Nariman's conclusion that manifest arbitrariness is a ground to set aside plenary legislation. So, I as a lawyer find this extremely a joyous thing to do, because manifest arbitrariness is like public policy. It has no limitations. You can argue manifest arbitrariness is in as arbitrary a manner as possible. And I'll give you an example why I'm saying this. The dangers of it on the other side. The dangers of it is like the chancellor's foot, the proverbial chancellor's foot. The chancellor's foot is large enough, you know that is the extent of relief that you will get. Manifest arbitrariness was applied in a recent judgment by Justice Nariman while striking down Section 87 of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act. Now, Section 87 of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act, as all of you may possibly know, was an amendment brought about ultimately to Section 37 of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act, whereby an award which was passed prior to the 2015 amendment would ultimately stand protected, and there was no need to obtain a stay of an order. And by a retrospective amendment, they said whatever has happened till 2015 will remain, whatever is there after that will be covered by the amendment of 2015. Now, I don't know how, but applying this principle of manifest arbitrariness, the Supreme Court struck down that section and said that it is manifestly arbitrary and that it did not take into consideration various facts which were cited in the earlier judgment of the Supreme Court, and struck it down. While I don't think anyone can dispute the fact that it was entirely within the competence of the legislature to determine what are within the what can be retrospective and what need not be retrospective. Now, this is one example of how manifest arbitrariness can be utilized by a judge who wants to strike down legislation. Therefore, while I as a lawyer think it's a great idea that you have this principle of manifest arbitrariness manifesting itself in all its glory, the dangers of manifest arbitrariness when it comes to striking down plenary legislation is as strong and possibly will depend from a judge to a judge. Now, having said this, and another judgment which I wanted to speak about was Shreya Singhal. Shreya Singhal, of course, actually in some way started off this whole number of cases where laws were struck down one after the other, and I think you have a bold judiciary now which is ready to strike down legislation as and when it is found to be manifestly arbitrary. Though Section 66A of the Information Technology Act was not struck down by the Supreme Court on this principle of manifest arbitrariness, the Supreme Court found various other principles, constitutional vagueness, violation of Article 90 and so on and so forth. But this really started off, if I may say, new jurisprudence on how to strike down laws which are otherwise perceived to be illegal. Now, I'd actually take a step a few years back, though we are speaking of 10 years of how fundamental rights have changed. I think one judgment which I want to speak of is a little older. It's a 9-judge bench judgment of the Supreme Court in Coelho versus State of Tamil Nadu. This has a little background, and the reason I'm also speaking of this is because of its historical importance. Many may know that the first amendment that was brought about by the Indian Constitution, by the Indian Parliament, was an amendment which practically seemed like it was seeking to alter the very basis of the Constitution. Why this happened was because Pandit Nehru realized that many of his reforms, like the Zamindari abolition, which was planned around the 1950s and was the manifesto of the Congress Party, were suffering significant defeats at the hands of the judiciary in those years. So they had to find an innovative way of getting out of this. In addition was the problem of the Madras High Court striking down certain intrusions into the right of the press in Ramesh Thappar's case. Therefore, they needed to change and bring about some change. That was the genesis of the 9th schedule to the Constitution of India. Now, the 9th schedule to the Constitution was brought about to bring in laws which would be away from judicial scrutiny. So, judiciary could never touch that. Of course, there were judgments after that which started off with Golaknath ultimately, and from Golaknath came to Keshavanand Bharati. But the 9th schedule continued to remain on the statute, in the Constitution, because every law which was now introduced into the 9th schedule was by virtue of a constitutional amendment. And therefore, by introduction of new laws, and it became a little brazen, because legislatures would now request that many legislations which ought to be included, which possibly would never have stood constitutional law muster, was now introduced into the Schedule 9, and therefore became something which courts could not touch. So Coelho came ultimately to analyze as to what was the basic structure doctrine. Now, Coelho said acts that are part of the 9th schedule are not outside judicial scrutiny. They are and will be judicially scrutinized, but ultimately on principles which are akin to the basic structure doctrine. Now, basic structure means what? Basic structure could mean it's an undefined concept and have been defined in some cases, but Coelho says it's Article 14, Article 19 and Article 21. Now, no one can dispute the fact that this has achieved the status of being the basic structure. But for some strange reason, they don't answer the question as to why Article 15 or Article 16 or Article 25, religious rights, are not protected by virtue of being part of the basic structure of the Constitution. This was highly criticized to some extent, because the Supreme Court had the great opportunity to lay down as to what out of Part 3 constitute those fundamental basic structure doctrine which no one can violate. Therefore, the sum and substance and the opening of the law insofar as the laws in the 9th schedule being outside judicial scrutiny was broken. So once that is broken, it opens up an argument that a certain law is violative of Article 14, 19 and 21, and now with the principle of manifest arbitrariness, it, I think, shouldn't become too difficult for someone to challenge a particular law as being violative of Article 14. So, entirely theoretically speaking, it is possible for us today to challenge a law as being part of or being opposed to the basic structure doctrine. Although, even if one may argue that if it's in the 9th schedule but violative of a constitutional provision, not of Part 3, still it could be immune to judicial review. The other great advantage of Coelho is the fact that it recognizes that judicial review is part of the basic structure of the Constitution of India, but in saying so, the Supreme Court did not answer the question that when you say judicial review is part of the basic structure, it should mean that it should be a complete review. But if it is not a complete review, it is only a review to the extent of determining whether it falls within the basic structure or not. That takes us, interestingly, to Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, a judgment which I think has had the greatest far-reaching effects in our country, which laid down, if I may say so, all these principles: constitutional morality, transformative constitution, and the upholding of the rights of the homosexual people, and of course the transgenders in Nalsa versus Union of India. I don't want to go into great details of these judgments, because one strikes down a provision which made homosexuality an offence, and I'll come back to speaking of how constitutional morality has thereby developed. Also, if all of you look at Justice Deepak Mishra's judgment, the principle of transformative constitution has then also come into existence fairly strongly. Well, transformative constitution, as possibly most of you know, is that constitution is a live document. You cannot just interpret the constitution as it always was. The constitution must evolve depending on the needs of the situation, the needs of the people at a particular point in time. While constitutional morality is also, after all, an adjunct of the transformative nature, we must look at social morality versus constitutional morality. If social morality is not just enough, it must also fall foul of constitutional morality. And taking into consideration an offence such as Article 377, which possibly to most may be abhorrent, the law having been struck down is a fantastic step towards ultimately recognizing the dignity of man. Therefore, this judgment, according to me, recognizes the fact that equality of men and women, and of people who believe that they should have the right of choice, are equally recognized. This judgment is ultimately, I think, human rights jurisprudence at its very best. Another judgment which I want to speak of to some extent, and possibly take some time, is also a judgment called Joseph Schein versus Union of India, which was the decriminalization of Section 497, that is, of adultery. Adultery, as you all know, could only be committed by a man, for reasons that I don't know. Adultery was subject matter of two cases. In both those cases, Supreme Court held that it should be examined as being something which is law enacted under 15(3) of the Constitution, that is, to protect the interests of a woman, and therefore negative discrimination or protective discrimination is definitely permissible insofar as a woman is concerned. This protection, or this conceptual equality that was there, and which I think you could see after that a change in the mindset, and therefore there was a need now all of a sudden for courts to recognize that men and women should be treated equally, and something like adultery should no longer be a crime. This actually, according to me, marks a significant change. It also results in the protection of the rights of men. While we look at Article 14 and we realize that Article 14 should treat everyone equal, and Article 15(1) prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex, you have a provision which stares at your face and which was subject matter of two judgments of the Supreme Court which upheld Section 497. A bold decision, therefore, of the Supreme Court to say that we will now strike down a law, although earlier judges have said that this is in some way for protection of women. The concept of substantive equality, the concept of conceptual equality of a woman with a man, and to avoid invidious distinction based on gender stereotypes. Just to give you a little background, in Saumitri Vishnu's case, and in another judgment called Yusuf Abdul Aziz, which was also by 5 judges, there was a stand taken that this law should be upheld. Now, Supreme Court then moving forward and finding a way to decriminalize adultery is, according to me, a step in the right direction, and this is a step ultimately to protect the rights of men as much as it is of women. Now let's look at how the Supreme Court then went ahead and protected women. Marital rape is one issue which has now been pending in the Supreme Court. So we're not dealing with marital rape because marital rape has not yet been answered. But what has been answered is exception 2 to section 397 section 375 of the Indian Penal Code. Now, exception 2 provided that if a woman is married to a man and if she is above the age of 15, then there is no criminality achieved with sexual intercourse with a married woman. The justification offered was ultimately, in Indian society, there could be several scenarios where, with the consent of everybody, a girl is given in marriage to a boy, and although a woman is not entitled to consent until she reaches the age of 18, a consent is deemed by virtue of the exception 2 to section 375. This gave a little bit of a difficulty for the judges, because if you look at the POCSO Act or the Prohibition of Child Marriages Act, then there was an automatic punishment for a marriage with a minor without this exception, and therefore the offence also was for the same length of time as it was under section 375 of the Indian Penal Code. Now everyone were in a quandary. It is not an offence under 375, but it is an offence under the POCSO Act as well as under the Prevention of Child Marriage Act. Therefore, Justice Madan Lokur found a very strange mechanism where I think it is not just reading down of the law, but practically judicial legislation which went about. Justice Lokur said that instead of 15, it will be read as 18. And therefore, all of a sudden, you have 15 being replaced with 18 to make it consistent with the other laws. Now, well, it's a revolutionary judgment. It's a judgment which, without doubt, ensures that the rights of a woman are protected. But many may argue that this was completely a strange way of intruding upon the legislative powers and altering 15 to 18, and then saying exception 2 remains as it is. Exception 2 is not struck down. You must remember, exception 2 is not struck down in the judgment, because the challenge to the exception was withdrawn by some of the petitioners, and therefore there was no challenge to exception 2. Therefore, exception 2 was altered by saying instead of 15, it will be read as 18. Therefore, by virtue of it, it really practically makes that provision of no consequence whatsoever, and brings it in line with all other laws. Therefore, while on the one hand the Supreme Court protected the rights of men, on the other hand the Supreme Court protected something abhorrent like rape, where consent was assumed because of marriage. But look at the consequences now. Whoever was part of getting a girl married to a man who possibly was above 18 or less than 18 or less than 21 would also be subject to criminal prosecution. Therefore, the parents of the boy, the parents of the girl, the relatives who attended weddings and who knew the age of the child are equally responsible for aiding and abetting a child marriage. Consequences, of course, we are really not concerned. We are talking of ultimately fundamental rights and the changes that have now come in. I want to now talk of an interesting case which deals with the with habeas corpus, with the writ of habeas corpus. This is interesting. It also came from the Madras High Court. Writ of habeas corpus was filed by a father saying his daughter was missing. Daughter had gone away with a Muslim boy, and the girl came to the court and said that she's gone away with him of her own volition. She was above the age of majority. She was 24 years old, and therefore the court said, well, if she is happy to go, she is entitled to go. But after a few days, another petition came to be filed saying that the girl is going to be shifted to Syria, and that this entire thing is a mask actually to take her away. The girl came back, and within no time married that boy with whom she was. The Madras High Court, of course, was led by a slightly different principle. Madras High Court said that this is a strange scenario where actually women are being transported out of India, and therefore we must prevent it. The girl was separated from the boy. The girl was said to be kept in a different place, and then the husband went to the Supreme Court. Therefore, the question there was, now, what is the scope of the writ? Should the writ of habeas corpus be extended to actually determine what is ultimately going to happen with the girl or not? Whether the girl is going to be transported out of India, whether the marriage was valid? Is that the scope of the writ of habeas corpus? Well, Supreme Court did not agree with the Madras High Court. Supreme Court said it is no part of the business of the High Court acting while dealing with the writ of habeas corpus to determine as to what will ultimately happen to a girl or to a particular person. It is only ultimately to get the body and present the body before the court. And if the person is willing to go and is of an age of majority, then there is no part that the High Court plays in ultimately trying to prevent a person. The writ of habeas corpus comes to an end there. You will find there are a lot of High Courts which take drastic steps in trying to tell people as to where they should be or where they shouldn't be, whether they should be married, whether they should go with the parents, whether they should stay with the boy with whom they've gone away. Therefore, an expansion of the writ of habeas corpus was what was ultimately held by the Supreme Court to be incorrect. Now I'm going to take a couple of this. Therefore, I'm just giving you a fairly cross-section of the various judgments which are there. We'll ultimately try and summarize as to how it fits those 3 or 4 principles which I spoke of. I think one judgment which misses many persons' attention but has, I think, the greatest significance in constitutional law as well as in criminal law is a judgment called Selvi versus State of Karnataka. This was a judgment which analyzed as to whether there is justification in forcing narco analysis on criminals who are arrested. When you speak of narco analysis, it could assume various forms, one of which is a lie detection test. One is introduction of a chemical into a person to get information out of him. The Supreme Court was, of course, concerned with the absolute constitutional right under Article 23, that is the principle of self-incrimination, or the principle against self-incrimination. And therefore it became extremely crucial as to find out as to whether a forceful introduction of a test of this kind would violate that constitutional guarantee. You must remember that that even at the time of emergency, when all fundamental rights can possibly be taken away, there are two fundamental rights which cannot be. One is Article 21 and the second is Article 20. And therefore Article 20 stands on that high a pedestal. Now this recognition in Selvi led to the court saying that you cannot have any situation where there will be a forced analysis conducted on a particular criminal to either find out the truth or otherwise. They went a step further. They said even if it is voluntary, namely I subject myself to this analysis, I subject myself to say I will go through a lie detector test, even there that statement must be recorded before a magistrate. It should be proved that it is of free consent, and after which whatever is recorded, the test itself does not become evidence. What becomes evidence is only the information that is gathered out of the questioning that occurs at that point in time, which is similar to any kind of questioning by the police. When the police questions an accused, and he even admits to the crime, that confession is not admissible in court. But the material that is gathered from that questioning is what is admissible in court. Therefore, the Supreme Court recognized that fundamental right under Article 23, the principle of self-incrimination, ultimately held that a criminal is entitled to the benefit of the constitutional guarantee against self-incrimination. Therefore, this judgment, according to me, though is not really spoken of at great length, recognizes both Article 21 and Article 20 of the Constitution of India. In Bombay, there were these ban against dance bars. The argument was dance bars are a place for trafficking of women, for prostitution, and that therefore they must be banned. This is a classic case where constitutional morality is examined at some length. It is not just constitutional morality, but also a morality that is imposed by the legislature or by the executive on the people. Supreme Court said that constitutional morality cannot be recognized in law. That imposition of morality on a citizen and requiring the citizen to therefore act in that mechanism or in that particular manner cannot be accepted. Now, this is a very strong step. A judgment of this kind, to say that the morality of the populace is not what the legislature determines it to be, but what the court thinks it should be, is going to have significant repercussions, because it will depend on who the judge is. It will have absolutely nothing else to determine it by. You have a judge who thinks it is constitutionally moral, it will be struck down. If you think it is constitutionally immoral, it will be upheld. Therefore, you are today giving up, and ultimately, of course, in this case, the legislation was struck down, at least in material particulars, and it was held that the bar against dance bars is illegal. The other principle, of course, the court also found was there was no empirical data to say there was human trafficking, there was no empirical data to show that there was prostitution, which was the consequence of this, and the like. But given all of this, for the court to step in and say that morality of the court is really a reflection of morality of the people is, according to me, a rather dangerous stand to take. The reason I say this is because there's not just one Supreme Court. There are courts throughout the country. There are high courts all over, and there are going to be decisions which will reflect the morality of every judge rather than of the entire population. Therefore, this is something which people must think about and consider when dealing with the situation of a law which could be on the borderline of being immoral. Of course, there are others which are completely immoral, but it depends on societal mores at that particular point in time. I'd like to now talk a little on privacy. I'm sure it's been spoken of more often than not, but 9 judges of the Supreme Court getting together to ultimately decide an issue of this kind, which had far-reaching significance, especially in the context of Aadhaar. According to me, has a lot of importance in our constitutional scheme, not just because of ultimately holding that privacy is part of our fundamental right, that a right to live in dignity and to have the dignity to decide as to what should be protected and what should not be is extremely crucial. Justice Nariman actually grades it into 3 parts. He speaks of bodily privacy, informational privacy, and third, privacy of choice. See, to many of us it might have seemed, and there were many judgments of course which without realizing it had already held that privacy is a fundamental right as well under Article 21. But in view of Kharak Singh and various other judgments, whether privacy was going to be held to be a fundamental right, or whether it was going to be a right which was right limited by a statute, was really the question to be examined. To hold that it is today part of Article 21 of the Constitution does not, of course, mean that you have an absolute right of privacy. Right of privacy is ultimately subject to public interest. It is subject to laws which are just, fair, and reasonable, because 21 says it is subject to laws which are just, fair, and reasonable. I'd like to just read out a few things which, according to me, have been said, and these possibly constitute the essence of this judgment. I don't want to deal with it in great length otherwise, because this basically is something which Article 21 protects today. Supreme Court said privacy has always been a natural right. The sanctity lies in its functional character, and it is related to dignity. Privacy is intrinsic to freedom, liberty, and dignity. Privacy can be both negative and a positive, and can have both negative and positive content. Information privacy is a facet of the right to privacy, and any infringement of the right to privacy has to fulfill the test of proportionality, namely an existence of law. It should be a legitimate state need, and it should be proportionate. Proportionality ultimately becomes an extremely important argument in all these cases, and it is proportionality which will determine as to whether a particular law will stand the muster of Part 3 of the Constitution or it will not. To my mind, apart from this, and I'll take some time with the last judgment which I want to speak about. The last judgment which I want to speak of is the judgment of the Supreme Court in Common Cause versus Union of India, which went into the question of the right to die with dignity. The right to die with dignity is, it was a difficult case because in Gyan Kaur, Supreme Court had held that attempt to commit suicide would continue as a criminal offence, and therefore right to die was not an absolute concept. There was also an argument that if you want to make any law with respect to the right to die with dignity, it has to be by a legislation that is introduced in Parliament, and that is ultimately the only way. Now, Supreme Court said it did not agree. Supreme Court said that it need not necessarily mean that the right to die cannot be decided by the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court then went into the question of what kind of euthanasia is permissible. can there be active euthanasia? Active euthanasia means, of course, a situation where you introduce something, a chemical, into a body to kill a person or to put life to an end. The second was passive euthanasia, where you withdraw life support to a person who is suffering from terminal illness and then he passes away. Now, in answering both of these, the Supreme Court looked at laws across the world and found that there was general universal acceptance to the principle that you can have passive euthanasia as a method to put an end to life. Now, it is with this principle that the Supreme Court started. In a unanimous judgment, Supreme Court held that the right to live includes the right to live with dignity. The right to live with dignity necessarily means that you are entitled to take your life away, but it is not as easy as saying that Gyan Kaur was overruled and that you can commit suicide. You can't commit suicide. You must show that you are suffering from terminal illness and that there is no hope of recovery. There must be a medical board which will decide this question, and then once that decision is made, you have therefore a right to die. Now, how do you do it? There are two ways, and the Supreme Court considered a concept called a living will. A living will is a concept where I write out my entire decision that if I am in a position where I will not live and possibly I can't communicate what I want to do, I'm entitled, life support should be taken away from me. If life support is taken away from me and I pass away, that shows a clear determination that a person has made that, in many foreign countries they call it the DNR, the do not resuscitate. If I'm in a scenario of that kind where I'm going to pass away, I should be allowed to pass away. It's also called an incurable passivity. The Supreme Court referred to one judgment which I think is an extremely important judgment of the English courts called the Airedale case, where the English courts have accepted the principle that the sanctity of life is not absolute. And then Supreme Court, instead of calling it a living will, called it an advance directive. Therefore, I am today entitled to make an advance directive saying that if I am in a situation where I am uncurable, where possibly I have lost my mind as well, I may be allowed to die an honorable death. That is, I think this judgment has such far-reaching consequences and recognizes that right that all of us have to live a life with dignity, to live a life in a manner in which we choose. It includes the right of choice, and ultimately the Supreme Court held that if it is found that the advance directive given or the living will has been given with free consent, of course it is not easy to give an advance directive of this kind. It must be signed in front of a judicial magistrate. The judicial magistrate must record that it was done by a man who seemed to have free consent, who was in his right senses. It is possibly more than writing a will, where you only have to register your will, but here you have to go to a magistrate. The magistrate has to keep a copy of this living will or of this advance directive, and that has to be cross-verified at the time when life support is taken away from a particular person. Therefore, if you look at each of these judgments, you will see something extremely interesting called the silences of the Constitution. Basically, it is what the Constitution does not say. There are many things that we read and we know of what the Constitution says, but what it doesn't say is equally important today. Of course, I may be wrong in saying that it is equally important today, because if you look at Keshavanand Bharati's case, Keshavanand Bharati's case was also a case where there was no concept of a basic structure. That was the silence of the Constitution, if you might take it that way. It was a silence of the Constitution which was never reflected on paper, but the Constitution manifested altogether, and that is how the doctrine was given life. Let me give you actually an instance or an interesting case after that. After Keshavanand Bharati, where the principle of basic structure was accepted by the Supreme Court, came a situation where Indira Gandhi brought about the 39th Amendment to the Constitution. The 39th Amendment said that a person who becomes a Prime Minister, her election will never be subject to challenge before any regular court and will only be subject to scrutiny by a body established by Parliament. Now in Indira Gandhi versus Raj Narayan, that question was gone into. In that case, the Supreme Court accepted basic structure and said judicial review is part of the basic structure of our constitution, democracy is part of our basic structure, and therefore an amendment to the constitution which takes away that particular right of a person to approach a court to challenge an election can never be taken away. Now that is the first principle of the silencers of the constitution. Now if you look at subsequent judgments now, if you look at privacy for instance, privacy is another classic example of the silencers of the constitution. How the constitution recognizes a right which is not specifically stated anywhere. As a matter of fact, there is an interesting article, if all of you are interested, by Mr. Fali Nariman, who goes into this in great detail and examines as to how silences of the constitution must be understood and how they are practically some kind of a conscience which is underlying the entire constitution. If you look at all our judgments, they all, at least the ones which we have spoken of today, they focus almost entirely on constitutional morality. And constitutional morality, as wide and varied as it can be, constitutional morality can have and will have over the coming years exceeding significance on how one must look at the constitution, because the constitution by itself doesn't have, of course, any morality attached to it, but the morality must be inferred from various provisions of the constitution. And that takes us, of course, with these two principles comes what we understand as a transformative constitution, a constitution which is alive, a constitution which cannot or can never be said to remain idle, a constitution which will continue continuously evolving depending on the needs which are going to ultimately be decided by the Supreme Court, because ultimately the constitution is what the Supreme Court tells us is the constitution. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. This is my brief talk, and I realize that issues of this kind require more often than not discussion rather than monologue. Therefore, I open up questions if you have any, and we can speak of this at a little length. Now, thank you.
That's very so we have some. The first one is, what is the difference in standard between arbitrariness in EP Royapa as applicable to administrative actions and manifest arbitrariness?
Okay, so I'm not going to analyze EP Royapa now. If you look at, actually if you simply take a step back and look at McDowell's case, which was a case which Justice Nariman argued and failed. He argued that manifest arbitrariness is really not just part of subordinate legislation or administrative action. It is also applicable to plenary legislation. So plenary legislation is law made by Parliament, and therefore the argument at that point in time was rejected by the Supreme Court, saying, sorry, that is not correct. You cannot take a concept of arbitrariness and impose it on Parliament. You look at one or two principles, whether the law is fair, just and reasonable, whether the competence was there in the legislature. Now, what then changed? What changed was Shaira Banu's case. Shaira Banu's case, that same principle was put as law. And then the Supreme Court turned it around and said that manifest arbitrariness is a principle that emanates out of reasonableness. Therefore, if a law is manifestly arbitrary, then that law must necessarily be struck down. Therefore, if you look at it objectively, both subordinate legislation as well as plenary legislation have the benefit of a presumption of constitutionality. That is not taken away, it applies to both. It is for a party who wants to challenge to demonstrate that a particular action is unconstitutional. Manifest arbitrariness, as I said, can take the form of a concept like public policy is an arbitration law. It's an unruly horse. But if it depends on who is manning the horse. If the judge who's managing the horse knows how to control the horse, then manifest arbitrariness is ultimately going to be a concept which will be accepted and will become a principle on the basis of which legislative action will now be determined.
Thank you. The next question is, do you think the recent amendment to the IBC on the 24th of March, increasing the threshold limit for triggering the corporate insolvency resolution process to 1 crore rupees is constitutionally valid? Although the intention behind the said amendment was to provide a boost to the MSME during the period of lockdown, the amendment increases the threshold limit irrespective of sectors or category. It does not even take into account the defaulters who have defaulted prior to the amendment. What is your view on this?
I actually would like to tell you, you must ask Justice Nariman this question because of him striking down Section 87 of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act. I don't know the answer therefore, but I don't think there is anything wrong with altering it. Who said it should be 1 lakh? The legislature said it should be 1 lakh. So if it is 1 lakh or 1 crore, it shouldn't make any difference at all. It is ultimately up to the legislature to decide what is the threshold limit at which you must trigger a corporate insolvency resolution process. Now, will it apply prospectively? Will it apply retrospectively? What happens if there is already a default? Well, it is ultimately triggering of a court or triggering of a process in court. So, when you're triggering of a process in court, then necessarily you must fall within that threshold. So, whatever has happened prior to that day assumes no significance unless the law has been made only to prospective defaults. I don't think the law has been made only for prospective defaults. It therefore will apply to all proceedings that require to be initiated now. And it doesn't matter whether sectors or categories really of no consequence according to me. It didn't make earlier a difference, it shouldn't make a difference now. It is within legislative competence, there is nothing arbitrary about it. Of course, one may say, why was it 1 lakh? Why not 2 lakhs? In the same way, you can say, why is it 1 crore? Why not 50 lakhs? There are no answers to it. Well, somewhere you need to put a threshold. The legislature makes that determination. The legislature puts it in place, and I don't think anyone can really find a fault with
it. Thank you. What is your view on the right to privacy and the Arogya Setu app that collects and analyzes a lot of personal data of users in the current scenario?
This is a very difficult question. Safeguards which are necessary to be provided are there in the Aadhaar case. What safeguards must be there and how safeguards must be therefore put in place are absolutely crucial. All information that we have to be protected. We have a right to privacy. We have a right to ensure that our personal information are protected. That is the law declared under the right to privacy judgment. There cannot be a violation of that. But I've not used Arogya Setu. I've not seen it. But I know it's not just in our country, but in several countries that there are several apps which determine where a person is, whether he's in the vicinity of people who have COVID-19 and what steps he must take therefore to ensure that he doesn't come in contact with them. Arogya Setu also, from what I understand, takes a lot of such information and collects it, but I don't know what steps have been taken to ultimately protect that data. The protection of this data cannot be any different from what is contained for Aadhaar because Supreme Court has recognized the right of privacy and therefore anything which would be contrary to that protection that is guaranteed under the Constitution would fall far. Because it ultimately depends on how and what the data and how it is protected.
Thank you. The next question is, in the evolution of this manifest arbitrariness doctrine, don't you think it blurs the line of doctrine of separation of powers as the judiciary gets a very wide power to question policy decisions of the legislature?
Now, manifest arbitrariness doesn't blur the line. Legislation can be made. There is nothing that says that legislation shouldn't be made, sometimes when we appear for the government now, especially when I appear for the government, I feel that possibly we should have taken the views of the court before we made legislation because everything that you do will be found fault with. But in any event, manifest arbitrariness is as manifestly arbitrary as it can be. I'm not a great fan of the doctrine, but it has today a recognition by the largest bench in recent times, and therefore you must live with it. I don't know if it blurs the line. But yes, it gives immense powers in the hands of a judge to decide what is arbitrary and what is not. A principle like manifest arbitrariness should be seen in a very wide fashion. You should look at every single possibility. You can't look at one possibility which one party brings to court and say, and this is manifestly arbitrary. There may be thousands of other scenarios which make it less manifestly arbitrary. And therefore, an effective balance must be drawn while using this principle, because otherwise, in the hands of a judge who doesn't understand it well or who doesn't apply it properly, it could be extremely dangerous, and therefore would strike down laws which are otherwise possibly entirely valid.
Thank you. The next question is, what is your view on marital rape within the constitutional scheme?
You see, the Supreme Court left open this question to be decided later. Even while deciding that issue of underage girls who are subject to rape, I think in that judgment itself they made it very clear that they're not going into the question of marital rape, and that is to be decided in a separate case. Well, I think rape in all its forms are wrong. I personally believe that marital rape can't ultimately sustain any form of sexual intercourse without the consent of the woman would possibly become an offence in the under the Indian Penal Code, and I don't think there will be real protection for it. But those are my views.
Thank you. The next question is, what is your view on the Sabarimala judgment?
I kept away from Sabarimala judgment deliberately because anyway, there is a review pending. There are other judgments which have come. I actually like Justice Indu Malhotra's view. Keep religion out of scrutiny by courts. But then, given the underlying principles of constitutional morality, and if you look at Sabarimala judgment itself, constitutional morality and the right not to discriminate, and the right, and of course, by saying that Article 25 does not apply, Supreme Court said that this is not an essential religious practice. How it will pan out, I don't know. But if I may give a short opinion on this, I think Justice Indu Malhotra's dissent is a good way of analyzing this and saying, actually, if you look at the minority view in Triple Talaq, the minority view in Triple Talaq of Justice Kehar and Justice Nazir also go into these principles and say that there may not be any logic to it. Many practices may be there which are peculiar to a particular religious sect or to a religion, but it is not something which has to have logic. It may be completely without logic, but there is no need to interfere if it is entirely religious in nature. It may be a scenario where someone else must interfere, namely the legislature may bring about a legislation, which is why in Triple Talaq, the Supreme Court, at least a minority view was that the legislature must step in, must bring about a legislation, and until it is brought in, the minority view was that the practice of Triple Talaq is injuncted. Therefore, it's a strange situation where everyone recognized it was wrong, but two judges said we should not interfere because it is an essential religious practice or so interconnected with the religion. Therefore, Sabarimala, I think, is, if you look at it entirely constitutionally, I agree with the majority view. If you look at it from a doctrinaire point of view, from a religion point of view, there may not be logic to it. It may be contrary to the constitution, but should the court really interfere and strike down what was a practice for so many hundreds of possible years?
The next question is, what are the safeguards in determining constitutional morality? I ask this from the context of how we have seen it applied thus far by the Supreme Court, and as you may foresee or recommend for the future.
Constitutional morality was explained by Justice Deepak Mishra in the 377 judgment. And he went into it in great detail. Constitutional morality has no bounds. It is like a philosophy. It depends, according to me, and the danger of looking at doctrines at this point in time is that doctrines can evolve depending on the circumstances and depending on the judge. It ultimately comes down and boils down to who the judge or judges are. Constitutional morality is the morality of the judge. And I think whether it is 5 judges or if it is 13 judges, it really shouldn't make a difference. It will ultimately boil down to what his morality was. And let me give you an example. In NAS Foundation, constitutional morality was completely different. They said, we are not going to interfere with 377. Those judges felt that it is a minuscule section of population for whom we must not really interfere. But then, when it ultimately came down to a larger bench, which examined it, constitutional morality underwent a change. Therefore, why I am saying this is absolutely no way one can say you can put it in a straitjacket formula, you can put in principles, you can put standards. There are no standards to constitutional morality. Constitutional morality is a morality, if I may say so, of a judge.
Thank you. The next question is, do you think the right to be forgotten or the right to erasure will find place in the Constitution?
Why not? Why can't we be forgotten if you want us? If that's the last decision that we make, that we must be forgotten and that all aspects with respect to us should be erased from history, except maybe if supervening public interest demands that our information should be kept somewhere to know that we were alive and we were around, at least possibly our social information, our information with respect to who we are, where we have come from. If that is the last decision that a person makes, just like I am entitled to say that I want to die if I am suffering from a terminal, incurable illness, I think it is entirely within the 4 corners of Article 21 to say that I should be forgotten. One may say, of course, that if public interest demands, there should be some information of that person somewhere, for a person should never vanish without a trace. There will be some trace, but yes, something which can be regulated in that sense. So I don't think the right to be forgotten can go away, but the right to be forgotten can only be after you die. I don't think the right to be forgotten can be triggered when you live and said, keep him away from all civilization. Of course, if you always have a right to be forgotten yourself, if you go and live in a forest and don't come out at all and don't meet people, I mean, in time people will forget you. So that ultimately will boil down to you. But well, it really depends.
The next question is probably an overlap of a previous question which you've answered, but I'll ask it anyway. If the constitutional morality has to be extracted from the provisions of the Constitution, wouldn't the interpretation vary depending on the individual judge's appreciation and understanding of what morality itself is? Therefore, wouldn't individual morality impact understanding of what constitutional morality is?
It's answered already. We've already answered this question. It's, as I pointed out, is the judge's morality. So.
Right. The next question is, the writ remedy for enforcing a right under Part 3 is essentially one against state action. In reality, most infringements of Part 3 often occur by non-state actors, such as political parties, fringe groups, and private players. What are your views on those who see this as a limitation? For example, a threat to an author or filmmaker by an activist group, whereby the only remedy would be to seek police protection or trial, which would anyway take years.
Well, that is part of our law. Part 3 is only against the state. Non-state actors violating or infringing on fundamental rights results in criminal action, results in civil consequences. Therefore, police protection is one, as Arjun points out. But at the very end, the right to obtain the writ is only going to be a right with respect to a state action or a state body. That, of course, will not change. I don't see any reason why it should change. It is not going to be that writ courts are going to be dealing with lives and liberties of individuals, whether from interpersonal relationships or from state actors. I think where it is limited is good enough.
So the next question is personal law for the purposes of Article 13 in Narasu Appa Malli, which held that it doesn't, still good law, or is there anything in Sabrimala or the Triple Talaq which dilutes?
Well, I'm not going to answer Sabrimala, but I think if you look at Triple Talaq was a case which went into the question of the 1937 Act, and everything revolved around the question as to whether the practice of triple talaq fell within the four corners of that law, and whether that law actually regulated it. That is how they brought it as law for the purpose of Article 13. That was where the difference came between the two benches, between the judges on the bench, which the minority view said that it is not governed by the 1937 Act, and therefore it was in practice outside the 1937 Act and a practice personally of the Muslims for centuries together. But Justice Nariman said it is regulated by the law. But the beauty of the judgment is neither point was ultimately accepted. The point which was ultimately accepted was that it is contrary to the Quran, and therefore it is a practice which cannot be accepted. Therefore, personal law by itself, if it is not codified, may not fall within Article 13. Therefore, one will have to analyze as to how Sabrimala will get decided ultimately.
Thank you. So the next question is: do you think testing constitutional validity of a legislation has become an inherent part of passing a legislation these days? How acceptable are presumption of constitutionality these days? And what is the nexus between judiciary's role as a counter majoritarian and presumption of constitutionality?
Okay, this is a very complex question, but let me answer this. Presumption of constitutionality has not altered. It was altered only in one case, where while dealing with Section 87 of the Arbitration Conciliation Act, Justice Nariman said, I will start with the presumption of unconstitutionality, and that the state must first justify constitutionality. Why that principle was changed, I don't know, but it was changed. I don't understand the first part of the question, testing constitutional validity of a legislation becoming inherent part of passing a legislation. We have a state has a presumption of constitutionality when it passes a legislation. It is up to the judiciary. It's difficult. I mean, judiciary has to find a justification to ultimately squash or hold a legislation to be unconstitutional. I don't think, if you look at least the recent judgments, I don't see any judgment which has actually crossed those lines very significantly and said that a law which was perfectly justified was struck down. I know people in Sabrimala case have a counter view on the entire issue. Therefore, it's a little difficult to actually answer this question without sounding contemptuous at times. But I think, I don't think the underlying principles of constitutionality have undergone any alteration.
Hello, sir. I'll be taking off on the questions over here.
Yeah.
Next question is: what is your view in a live-in relationship during pendency of divorce proceeding, in the view of adultery being struck down?
Well, you can't be criminally prosecuted. Quite apart from that, there is really nothing else. There is no bar on having a live-in relationship. You could get sued, possibly, but since it's no longer a criminal offence, you can live in a live-in relationship, and you won't be criminally prosecuted for it.
Thank you, sir. The next question is: in line with the principles you covered, do you foresee the decriminalization or striking down of attempt to suicide?
I don't know. For that, one constitutional bench judgment of the Supreme Court will have to be altered. In Gyan Kaur, Supreme Court said that the earlier judgment in Ratnam's case was incorrect and held that the decriminalization of attempt to suicide was a wrong judgment, and that it has to only be by legislation that an alteration can be made. I don't know if that will really go through again, and whether the Supreme Court will look at it, but the passive euthanasia judgment and the principle of right to live with dignity may run counter in some way to Gyan Kaur, although Gyan Kaur was examined at great length in the euthanasia judgment, and the Supreme Court did not find fault with it in any way. So I don't know.
Thank you, sir. So the last question is: whether the medium to access the basic necessary fundamental rights form a part of basic structure. For instance, in Anuradha Bhashan, it was held that the internet is necessary to carry on trade, which is a fundamental right. Now, when the government amends the laws relating to the medium to access the basic fundamental right, the fundamental right itself may get compromised and may affect the basic structure and constitutional policy. What is your view?
In some way, the question answers itself, because it says that the fundamental right itself may get compromised and affect the basic structure and the constitutional promise. If that is the case, yes, I agree that the medium to access basic rights may also form part of the basic structure. But basic structure also is a very indeterminate set of rules. You have some, but you don't have many. When you speak of the medium to access, we are of course speaking of internet as being the medium to access. We'll have to see as to how ultimately in Jammu and Kashmir this issue will be answered, as to whether internet will be held. Internet by itself will be held to be a right that is part of, let's say, the freedom of speech itself, and therefore the right to access information through the internet should become a right, a fundamental freedom itself. And if it does, then it would be part of the basic structure. And if it does, then a government which blocks internet maybe without justification covered under 19.2, may as well be found to be violating that fundamental freedom, and thereby the basic structure of the Constitution.
Thank you, sir.
Alright, I think that brings us to the end of this lecture session. Thank you very much for your time. It's been a very erudite session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for patient hearing.
Muted.
Huh? Yeah, right.
Bye.
Wallace and